Hi everybody, Steve Gonson here, and I just want to talk through the assessment for this course. This is just a general overview of the assessment. We will be talking about each assessment in the tutorials, and in the 2 weeks where there's a public holiday on the Monday, I think it's week 8 and week 3. I think I could be wrong about that. But anyway, in those weeks, we'll be dedicating the classes for those weeks to talk specifically about the assessments that you would be currently due at that time. Okay, so it's really important that you do turn up to those weeks. But this is just a very brief overview of the assessments and what is required. Now, the Thomas Leach has written a chapter. Thomas Leach has written a book on adaptation, and in the book there is a chapter called Between Adaptation and Illusion. And what he does is he kind of maps out 10 different types of adaptation, basically. And what I'm interested in exploring in all of the assessments are these different types of adaptation and how these different types of adaptation can be applied to different sorts of adaptations. Now, the good thing about his list is it's not this sort of hard and fast that it has to be one particular mode and that's it. What he's actually saying is that some adaptations will use maybe 3 modes from the list, while other adaptations might only use 1 mode from the list. In his chapter, at the very end of the chapter, he actually looks at Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, which we're going to be looking at in week 2, and he says, well, that's a film that actually applies to every mode of adaptation. So it's all kind of interesting what he's actually doing with it. But rather than sort of have each assessment do something entirely different, what I'm really interested in is by the end of this course that you have a good understanding of these different types or different modes of adaptation. So each assessment will sort of be asking you to apply these different modes to that. In week 2, I will be sort of going through this chapter in some detail and sort of explaining what each mode actually does. So don't worry too much about that at this point. But in the meantime, I suggest that you do have a good read of his chapter. The chapter is available on Blackboard. It's available on Blackboard under the Learning Resources in week 2, and it's also under the Assessments tab. I've made it available just so everyone has good access to it. Okay, so the assessments, there's basically 3 assessments for the course. There's a tutorial discussion, which you're going to do in kind of groups. That will be done from weeks 4 to 12. There's a defining adaptation where you're actually applying Leach's 10 different modes of adaptation to an adaptation of your choice. And there's also a creative and critical adaptation, and I'll just quickly talk through each one. Okay, so in the tutorial discussion, it's pretty simple. We'll just put you into groups 2 to 4. It really depends on how big the class sizes are, and what you'll be doing is you'll be basically investigating that week's adaptations. You'll need to read the adaptation, the readings, which are on Blackboard for that week. There'll be basically every week has a critical and a creative adaptation reading, the creative being the actual source of adaptation for the film that we're watching, and then there's also a critical sort of essay on that adaptation. Okay, and what you need to do is just read those through with your group, have a think about them, and really basically just apply some ideas to the classroom. And what I'm really interested in you doing is actually thinking of Thomas Leach's different modes of adaptation and thinking, okay, well, which ones actually apply to this film and which ones don't. And in my sort of mini lectures, I'll also be talking about that as well. Just I should just make it clear, there's sort of not a right and wrong answer to Thomas Leach's modes. Okay, it's really an interpretive thing. It's up to you to consider what each mode is doing and how that applies. For some films, you might think that every mode applies to the particular adaptation, while other films you might think, well, only one applies. It's really up to you to consider that. Be creative with how you interpret what Leach is actually saying. Okay. Yeah, and just in broader topics, I've actually got some questions on Blackboard that you can actually ask the class. So just have a look at those questions on Blackboard, which is, I think it's like general questions or something. It's just a sheet of just questions that you could ask about each adaptation. So if you're a bit stumped for what you can ask and where your conversation should actually go, I'd actually resort to that sheet, which is on Blackboard under the Assessments tab. And it's just the point of this discussion is it's very casual, it's very formal. You don't have to use PowerPoint, you don't have to use clips. You can use those things if you want, but it's really about just generating a class conversation. And some of the part of the assessment will actually be based on that. How well you actually generate a class conversation and how well you ask questions to the class that can actually include other members of the classroom. So the second assessment is defining adaptation, which is basically what you're doing is you're going to take an adaptation of your choice. Now, it can be from the course or it can be much wider if you want. It doesn't have to be a film adaptation if you don't want it to be. I'm assuming most people pick film adaptations if you want. Now, on Blackboard, under Assessments tab, I've actually put some examples of how people handled this assessment last year. So if you're a bit worried of how to structure it, you can actually just look at those examples. And it's basically just taking an adaptation and thinking about Leach's modes and just saying, okay, which ones apply to this adaptation and why? And that's all you have to do. It doesn't have to be that long. I'm thinking about 1,000 words would be the appropriate length for this. Now, what you need to do is not just sort of say why you think particular modes apply, but really discuss how they apply and give good examples from the film as to how this film is actually using particular modes in its own adaptation and rethinking its own adaptation. Okay, so that's the second assessment. And the final assessment is a critical creative adaptation. Now, there's no examples of this because this is the first time I've done this assessment. But all you have to do is basically there's two parts to the assessment. There's the creative portion, all right, which is what you have to do is you have to take anything from the course, any reading, any film, right, and you actually have to write your own adaptation based on that. So you can take a film if you want and base an adaptation on the film. You can take a reading and base an adaptation on the reading, right? And you can do it any way you want. You can write it as a screenplay, you can write it as a short story, you can do it as a graphic novel, as a song, as a poem, whatever you want with the creative point, all right? And then in the next part, what you have to do is you have to critically appraise that adaptation as if it was written by somebody else, and also consider what modes of Leach's could you apply to this adaptation. Okay, now I should just preface this by saying not everyone is like a skilled creative writer or artist or musician or anything like that. You're not being based or assessed on how well you creatively write your adaptation. What you're being based on is how well you've thought about this as an adaptation and how well you can apply Leach's modes to this adaptation. Okay, so don't freak out if you're thinking I can't draw, or I can't sing, or I can't write anything creatively. That's okay. It's about thinking about what you're actually doing in a creative way and then assessing that that as if it was somebody else's, right? Now, there are some rules to this assessment, and these are the rules. So you may address only films and or readings from the course. You may not use text or films already addressed in your earlier assessments, okay? You must address theory, criticism, historical, and other secondary sources in your critical review. So you do need to use a minimum of 2 external sources. You can use sources from the readings for this course if you so choose. Now, the length of the creative portion, the project is up to you. What I'm thinking about, it's really 2,000 words all up, okay? So what I'm saying, therefore, is just use samples or excerpts or just scenes from the creative work. So if you're writing a screenplay, just give me a couple of scenes of that, or make it a really short screenplay. Or if you're writing a short story, just give me a few examples of that. Okay, so the critical part of it really depends. Say you're doing a picture, right, or a graphic novel or something like that, right? You don't have to write 2,000 words for the critical component of it, right? I'll be thinking that the critical component of it would be about 1,000 words. So therefore you have about 1,000 words for the creative portion of it. If, of course, the creative portion doesn't take up any words, then I'm thinking about 1,000 words would be absolutely fine. If you're worried about that, just speak to your tutor and they can just clarify it, and I'll also clarify it over the coming weeks. Don't write over the 2,000 words. This is part of the discipline that we're asking of this assessment and all the assessments. Okay, you basically got there's a 10% rule in these assessments. You can either go 10% over or 10% under, and that's really what we're looking for. And good luck with it, because we're asking you to be as creative as you want and as daring as you want. Okay, have some fun with it. And I think the people who will do really well for this assessment are the people who are going to have a lot of fun with it and actually take the adaptation somewhere. Okay, so that's the assessments for this course. I hope it's all pretty self-explanatory. As I said, I'll be talking more about it in the lectures and also in those public holiday weeks, where there's 2 public holidays in this course that fall on the Monday, so there's no screenings for those weeks. But in the tutorials for that week, we'll be just dedicating some time to the assessments. Okay, I'll leave it there.